He had the whole thing timed out perfectly. The flight was booked. The documents were signed. The auction was set for Tuesday. All he needed was for me to be 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, completely in the dark. And I almost was, but I left something at home, something small, something stupid. And when I walked back through that door and heard his voice, that easy, satisfied voice, I understood in about 60 seconds that the man I had been married to for 7 years was not real. Neither was our life together. It was all a carefully crafted lie. But what he didn't know, neither was my flight.
If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. I was already on I-285 when I reached into my carry-on and didn't feel the case. It's about the size of a lip gloss, small, blue, easy to miss in a bag full of chargers and boarding passes and 3 different notebooks I told myself I would actually use. But I can't miss it for long because it's my insulin pen, and I had left it sitting on the bathroom counter next to my toothbrush like it was optional. I said something out loud in that car that I will not repeat here. I took the next exit and turned around. The flight was in 2.5 hours. I had time, barely if I moved. It was a Wednesday morning in October, and Atlanta traffic was doing what Atlanta traffic does, which is absolutely nothing helpful, but I know those streets. I know the backways. I cut through the neighborhood and pulled up to our house in Southwest Buckhead 18 minutes later. That's when I noticed the front door. Darius locked that door every single time he left a room. I used to tease him about it. He would lock the bathroom door inside our own house, lock the back gate when he came in from taking out the trash. He said it was habit, something his grandmother drilled into him as a kid. You lock what's yours. The front door was unlocked. I stood there on the porch for a second, key already in my hand, not quite understanding why something that small felt so wrong. Then I heard him. His voice was coming from upstairs. That was normal. His office was up there. He worked from home 3 days a week, and he kept those calls in his office with the door half closed. Normal. All of it normal. Except the tone. I have been with this man for 9 years, married for 7 of them, and I know every frequency his voice operates on. I know his work voice. Careful, measured, slightly formal. I know his phone with his boy's voice, loud, loose, laughing at everything. I know his talking to my mother voice, which is warm in a way that always made me feel lucky. This was none of those. This was soft, private, easy in a way that made my stomach tighten before I even knew why. I did not call out his name. I do not know exactly why I didn't. Maybe it was the unlocked door. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe something older and quieter in me already knew that whatever was happening upstairs was not meant for me to hear. I stepped inside and I let the door close behind me without a sound. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and I listened. You have to understand the layout of that house. It's a craftsman-style home in a neighborhood that has been in transition for about 15 years, meaning my parents bought it when it was still affordable and held on long enough to watch it become desirable. The ceilings are high. The staircase opens right into the front hallway. Sound travels in that house the way water moves downhill, easy and without asking permission. I could hear him clearly. He was talking to someone he called Babe, not honey, not baby. Babe, short, comfortable, worn in. The way you say a word when you've been saying it for a while. I stood there and I made myself listen, even though every part of me wanted to do something else. Walk out, walk up, make noise, pretend I hadn't heard anything. I have learned, over 19 years of working in forensic auditing, that the worst thing you can do when you stumble onto something real is react before you understand it. So I stood still, and I listened. He was talking about a property in Southwest Atlanta. He was talking about a foreclosure auction set for Tuesday. He was talking about power of attorney documents that had been signed and processed and filed without issue. And then he said my mother's address, my mother's actual street address, Miss Loretta's house, the house my father spent 31 years paying down, the house where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway and burned my first batch of biscuits in the kitchen and sat on the back porch with my daddy the night before he passed. He said that addressed the way you say a stock ticker. Just numbers. Just an asset. I put my hand on the banister because my legs felt strange. He said the auction was set for Tuesday. He said the documents were clean. He said the old woman didn't check her accounts anymore, hadn't in months. Then he laughed a little, that easy laugh, and he said, "She trusts me more than she trusts herself. That's the gift." She, me. He was talking about me. I don't know how long I stood there. Probably less than a minute. Might have been less than 30 seconds, but I heard enough. I heard the name of the shell company, Crestline Property Partners. I heard him mention flying out Wednesday night. I heard him say the words, "We're almost done, babe," with a warmth in his voice I had spent 7 years believing was mine. I turned around. I walked back to the front door. I opened it. I stepped out. I pulled it closed behind me, slow and careful, until I heard the latch catch soft as a whisper. Then I walked to my car, and I drove away. I went around the corner, and I parked on a side street I have driven down probably 1,000 times in my life, and I turned the engine off and I sat there. I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that because people always assume that's what happens in a moment like this. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I was doing the thing I do when something lands that I'm not ready for. I went very, very still, and I let my brain start working. But first, I had to let myself go back. 9 years ago, I was not doing well. I was managing it. I was showing up to work and keeping my apartment clean and returning phone calls within a reasonable window, but I was not doing well. My father had died 14 months earlier. My business partner at the time, a woman I had trusted completely, had left our firm and taken 2 of our biggest clients with her. I was 34 years old and I felt like I was rebuilding from dirt. I met Darius at a professional development conference in Charlotte. He was in commercial real estate then, or so he told me. I was presenting a breakout session on fraud detection in small business accounting. He stayed after, asked smart questions, genuine ones, or what felt like genuine ones. He wanted to know how I had gotten into the field. He wanted to know what I loved about it. Nobody at a conference had ever asked me what I loved about my work. They asked about rates and referrals and whether I had a card. He asked what I loved. We had dinner that night and talked for 4 hours. He was easy to be with in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not showy, not performing, just present. He flew down to Atlanta 3 weeks later, and I remember being surprised that he actually came. I had half expected the whole thing to dissolve the way conference connections usually do. He met my mother on his second visit. Miss Loretta did not warm to people quickly. She was polite, she was gracious. But warm took time with her. She had grown up in a family where you watched people before you trusted them, and she had passed that habit on to me even if I hadn't always used it well. She warmed to Darius in about 45 minutes. He fixed a cabinet door that had been sticking for 2 months. He asked her about the photographs on the wall. Who was who, where they were taken, what year. He sat at her kitchen table and ate 2 servings of her sweet potato pie and told her it was the best thing he had put in his mouth since his grandmother's cooking. And Miss Loretta laughed in a way I hadn't heard her laugh since my father got sick. After he left that evening, she looked at me and said, "That one is real." I believed her. I had no reason not to. I had every reason to want her to be right. We got married the following spring. Small ceremony, nothing elaborate. My mother's garden, 28 people, food from the same woman who had catered every family gathering for 20 years. My cousin Denise did the flowers. My father's oldest friend walked me down the aisle because my father couldn't. It was imperfect in 100 small ways, and I loved every single minute of it. Darius cried. I want to be accurate about that because it matters to the story. He stood at the end of that aisle and his eyes filled when he saw me, and he pressed his lips together and blinked and reached for my hands and held them like he meant it. I have replayed that moment many times in the months since all of this came apart. I have asked myself whether any of it was real. whether the emotion was genuine or manufactured, whether there was a version of him, even briefly, that was not performing. I don't have a clean answer. I don't think I'll ever have one. What I know is that a person can be moved by something they are also exploiting. Those two things can exist in the same body at the same time. That is not exculpatory. It is just true, and I have had to sit with it. In the early years of our marriage, the life we built felt solid. He was good company. He was funny in a dry, observational way that matched how I saw the world. He could sit in comfortable silence, which matters to me more than most people realize. He did not require constant performance or reassurance, which I had encountered enough of in previous relationships to appreciate its absence. He had opinions about things that weren't his area of expertise, about design, about food, about the shape of a neighborhood. And he was usually right, which I found interesting. I was, by any honest accounting, happy. I built my career during those years. I made partner. I expanded my client base to include municipal contracts that I had been working toward for a decade. I traveled more than I wanted to, worked more hours than were healthy, came home to a house where dinner was often ready and the dishes were done, and someone had thought to buy more coffee before we ran out. When I told people about my marriage, what I said and meant was, it works, the way the best things work, without a lot of friction, without requiring you to fight for your right to be yourself inside it. I was wrong about all of it, but I was not stupid. That is the distinction I have had to learn to hold. 2 years ago, my mother had a minor stroke. Nothing devastating, thank God. She recovered well, her speech came back fully, her mobility was fine. But it frightened her. It frightened both of us. And in the aftermath of it, she got confused about things she had always managed without any trouble. Her accounts, her bills, the property taxes on the house, the rental income from the unit she leased out in the back. Darius volunteered to help her. He was so natural about it, so matter-of-fact. He said he had helped his own aunt manage her finances after she got older, said he knew how overwhelming it could get, said he was happy to take it off our plates. Miss Loretta was grateful. I was grateful. I was in the middle of a complicated audit for a municipal client, and I was working 60-hour weeks, and the idea of not having to worry about my mother's paperwork, just for a season, just until she was fully steady, felt like mercy. I handed him the keys. I did not realize, sitting in that car around the corner from my house, that I had handed him everything. I am a forensic auditor. I have spent 19 years finding the places where money disappears and figuring out who made it disappear and how. I have sat across from accountants and executives and church treasurers and small business owners and walked them through exactly how they were deceived, exactly which document they signed that opened the door, exactly which moment of trust was the one that cost them. And I sat in that car and I thought about the papers I had signed without reading. It had been a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was in the middle of a reporting deadline and I had my laptop open at the kitchen table with 3 windows going and a half-eaten plate of food beside me. Darius brought a folder over and set it next to my elbow. He said it was a refinancing package for Miss Loretta's property, said the new structure would lower her monthly outlay significantly, that he had already walked her through it, that she was comfortable with everything, that he just needed my signature as co-trustee on a couple of the pages. I asked him if it was straightforward. He said, "Yes, babe. You know I wouldn't bring you something complicated when you're in the middle of all this." I signed where he pointed. 4 places, maybe 5. I did not read the documents carefully. I told myself I would review them later when I had bandwidth, and later never came, and I had completely forgotten about them by the following week. Now I sat in my car trying to reconstruct what those documents might have actually said. Power of attorney. That was what he had mentioned on the phone. Power of attorney over my mother's property. Which meant that at some point, either in that stack of papers or in a separate set he had presented to Miss Loretta alone, she had signed over the authority to make decisions about her home to someone else, to him. I thought about my mother sitting across from him at her kitchen table, him explaining things in that patient, gentle way he had, her nodding and trusting because he was my husband and I had vouched for him with my whole life. I thought about her signing something she didn't fully understand because she believed we were protecting her. I thought about the home equity line of credit Renee would later confirm, almost $200,000 pulled from a property my parents had spent their lives paying down. I thought about where that money had gone. I thought about 4 months of missed mortgage payments while Darius intercepted every statement, every notice, every letter from the bank. I thought about the foreclosure auction set for Tuesday. Then I picked up my phone and I texted my assistant Diana. I told her the London trip was being postponed. Family situation. Keep it quiet. If anyone from the international office reached out, she could tell them I'd be in touch within 48 hours. Then I opened a hotel booking app and found a room near Buckhead under my coworker Patrice's name. Then I drove there, and I checked in, and I sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like cleaning solution and central air, and I thought about what my mother always told me. Don't move until you know where you're moving to. Here is what I wanted to do. I wanted to drive back to that house, walk through the front door I now knew he had left unlocked because he thought I was 30,000 feet in the air and already irrelevant, climb those stairs and stand in the doorway of his office until he turned around and saw me. I wanted to watch his face. I have imagined probably 100 times since that morning what his face would have done. I have replayed it in my mind the way you replay a song you can't stop thinking about. The shock, the recalculating, the pivot to whatever he would have tried next. Denial, probably, then charm, then some version of a story that made it all my misunderstanding. I did not go back. I have my mother's voice in my head in moments like that. Miss Loretta does not raise her voice. She does not operate in extremes. She says what she means in a tone that assumes you are smart enough to hear it. And what she has always said, in every situation I can remember that called for action, is, don't move until you know where you're moving to. Running back in there would have felt like something. It would not have accomplished anything. If I confronted him now, he would know I knew. And the second he knew I knew, 2 things would happen. First, he would move. Whatever money was still accessible, whatever accounts weren't yet locked down, whatever next step in the scheme could be accelerated, he would move on all of it the moment I telegraphed that his cover was blown. Second, I would have nothing. No documentation, no legal protection, no court orders, no forensic trail, just my word against whatever story he came up with, and I had already seen how convincing his stories could be. I had believed them for 7 years. So I sat in that hotel room. I ordered something from the room service menu that I didn't taste. I turned on the television and watched it without hearing it, and I thought through what I needed and in what order I needed it. The first call I made was to Renee. Renee Washington and I have been friends since our sophomore year at Spelman, which means we've been through approximately everything together. 2 divorces between us, 3 cross-country moves, 1 cancer scare, 4 job changes, and a period in our late 20s that neither of us discusses in detail, but that involved a very bad decision about a timeshare in Hilton Head. She's a forensic accountant. She works with a mid-size law firm in Midtown Atlanta that handles white-collar defense and civil litigation. She has spent 15 years learning how people hide money and where it goes when they think no one is watching. She is also, under all of that, the person I call when I do not know what to do next, which almost never happens. But this was that moment. She picked up on the second ring. "I thought you were flying out today." "I need you to listen to me," I said, "and I need you to not ask questions until I'm done." She went quiet. Renee knows when I am serious the same way I know when she is. It's in the pace, the flatness. She said, "Okay." I told her what I had heard. I kept it factual. The shell company name, Crestline Property Partners, the mention of power of attorney, my mother's address, The foreclosure auction on Tuesday. The phrase he had used, "She trusts me more than she trusts herself." I did not tell her how I felt about any of it. I did not have the space for that yet. When I finished, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough for me to count my own heartbeats. Then Renee said, "Give me 12 hours." That was all. She didn't ask me if I was okay. She didn't offer condolences. She did not say, "I'm so sorry, Camille," or "I can't believe this," or "Are you sure you heard it right?" She knew that none of that was what I needed. What I needed was someone who knew how shell companies worked. I said, "Thank you." She had already hung up. That night, I texted Darius from the hotel bed. I had thought carefully about what to say and how to say it. Too much warmth, and it would feel off. I was supposedly jet-lagged and in a time zone 5 hours ahead. Too little, and he might notice the distance. I had to sound exactly like a woman who had just survived a transatlantic flight and wanted nothing more than sleep. I wrote, "Made it, exhausted. Room is nice, though. Going to turn in early. Miss you. Simple. Tired, slightly affectionate. Just enough." He responded in 4 minutes. "Get some rest, babe. You worked so hard for this. So proud of you." Heart emoji, heart emoji, heart emoji. I stared at those 3 hearts for a while. Then I put the phone face down on the nightstand and I opened my banking app. I went through every account I could access. The joint checking, the joint savings, the investment account we had opened together when we got married. I screenshotted everything, every transaction for the past 18 months, every transfer I couldn't immediately identify, every payee name that didn't look familiar. There were more of them than I expected. The amounts were modest, individually. 1,500 here, 2,200 there. Small enough to not trigger any automated flags, small enough to get lost in the noise of a household where 2 professional incomes were moving regularly. But when I started adding them up, rough math in my head, which I am good at, the number grew in a way that made my jaw tight. I flagged everything, and I sent the screenshots to an encrypted folder I set up on my phone that night. Then I lay in the dark, and I did not sleep for a very long time. She called at 7:43 the next morning. I had been awake since 5. I had already showered and made the weak hotel coffee and sat at the small desk by the window watching the sun come up over the parking garage across the street. I answered before the second ring. "Okay," Renee said. "Here's what I have." She had found Crestline Property Partners in 20 minutes. Delaware Incorporation, registered about 2 years ago, right around the time my mother had her stroke. The registered agent was a generic filing service, which was standard practice for people who didn't want their names on the front page. But the operating agreement, which Renee had gotten through a contact at a title company who owed her a favor, listed 2 managing members, Darius and a woman named Tanya Birch. "Who is Tanya Birch?" I asked. "That's what I'm working on," Renee said. "But here's the part you need to hear first. In the past 18 months, just over $500,000 has moved through accounts tied to Crestline. Some of it I can trace back to a home equity line of credit on your mother's property. The line was opened about 20 months ago. The full amount was drawn down within 60 days of opening." I did the math without being asked. My mother's house was worth somewhere between $380 and $420 in the current market. A home equity line at 70% would put the draw amount right in that neighborhood. "What's the mortgage situation?" I asked. 4 months behind, Renee said. "The bank filed foreclosure proceedings 6 weeks ago. All the notices went to a post office box." He intercepted them. "Almost certainly." I stood up from the desk and walked to the window and looked at the parking garage. A woman in scrubs was walking to her car. A man in a delivery uniform was unloading a dolly. Regular morning, regular world. "There's one more thing," Renee said. "In the transfer records, there's another company name that shows up a few times, Meridian Equity Group. I'm running it down now, but it could be connected. Give me until this afternoon." "Take what you need," I said. After we hung up, I sat with the name Tanya Birch. I did not know her. I was certain I had never heard her name before. But she was listed as co-owner of the company that had been draining my family's equity for a year and a half, which meant she was not incidental. She was structural. She was part of the architecture. I spent the next 2 hours going back through the screenshots I had taken from the banking app. Now that I had the crease line name to anchor the search, the pattern organized itself differently. The way a picture you've been looking at sideways suddenly resolves into something recognizable when you tilt it the right way. The transfers clustered in a rhythm, consistent amounts, consistent intervals, the careful calibration of someone who understands how fraud detection software works and has built their operation around staying just underneath the threshold that triggers flags. Darius understood fraud detection software because I had explained it to him more than once. Over dinner, during long drives, in the half-distracted way you explain your work to the person you share your life with, not thinking about who is listening or what they might do with what they learn. That realization sat with me in an unpleasant way. I needed to know who Tanya was, and I needed to know how far back this went. I drove to my mother's house the next morning at 8 o'clock. I had not slept well. I had rehearsed the conversation approximately 40 times in my head, and it still didn't feel ready, because there is no version of this conversation that feels ready. There is no script for sitting across from your mother and explaining that the man she called a gift, the man she had trusted with her home, her accounts, her signature, had been stealing from her in slow, careful increments for almost 2 years. She answered the door in her housecoat and her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. When she saw me, her face did what it always does when she's surprised and pleased at the same time. It opened up, like a window going from dark to light. "Camille, baby, what are you doing here? I thought you were in London." "Change of plans," I said. "Can I come in?" The kitchen smelled like coffee and the lavender lotion she has used for as long as I can remember. She poured me a cup without asking and set it in front of me and sat down across the table, and I could see in her eyes that she had already registered that something was wrong. My mother has always been able to read me. She says I carry my worry in my shoulders, that I hike them up when something is weighing on me, even when my face says otherwise. I asked her to show me every piece of paper Darius had ever given her. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "All right." And she went to the kitchen drawer, the wide one next to the refrigerator that had always been the family's catch-all for important documents, and she came back with a folder. I opened it on the kitchen table. There were 11 documents in that folder. Some of them I recognized. Standard forms, refinancing disclosures, a home equity agreement. Others I had never seen before. And on 3 of them, in the signature line designated for co-trustee, was my name, written in handwriting that was close to mine, not exactly mine. I know my own signature the way I know my own face, not from conscious study, but from a bone-deep familiarity that doesn't require analysis. These were close, practiced. Someone had spent time on them, but they were not mine. I put my hand flat on the table to keep it steady. "When did he have you sign these?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Most of them about a year and a half ago," she said. "He came by one afternoon when you were in Birmingham for that client meeting. He said you had already reviewed everything and just needed my signature to finalize. I asked if I should call you first, and he said you were in a meeting all day and he didn't want to interrupt." Of course he had said that. "He explained everything to me," she continued, her voice getting quieter. "He said the new structure would make things easier, lower payments, simpler management. He was so patient, Camille. He went through every page." I put the photographs of every document on my phone without telling her yet what I had found. I needed to have everything documented before I said the words. And then I looked up at her, and I told her. My mother is not a woman who falls apart. She has buried a husband, she has buried a sister. She sat with her own mother through the last 3 months of a slow and painful death, and she came out of that room still standing and still herself. She has always had what I think of as a very long fuse, connected to a very quiet core. She does not panic. She grieves. She worries. But she does not fall apart. She did not fall apart now. We went through every document together, one by one. I explained each one in plain language, what it meant, what it had authorized, what the consequences had been. She listened without interrupting. When I got to the home equity line, when I explained that close to $200,000 had been pulled from the equity in her home and moved into accounts she had never authorized, I watched her press her lips together and look at the window. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He called me Mama." Not as an accusation, not as a question, just a statement, offered into the air between us, as if she was trying to reconcile two pieces of information that could not exist in the same world. "He did," I said. "Why would he do that?" she asked. "Call me Mama and then do this?" I didn't have a clean answer. The honest answer was that people who do what Darius did are extraordinarily skilled at knowing exactly which gestures of warmth to deploy and when. The calling her Mama wasn't a sign of affection. It was a technique. But that is a very cold thing to say to your mother about a man she loved like a son-in-law. So I said, "He wanted what we had, and he thought we wouldn't figure it out in time." She looked at me. "Well," she said, "then we better figure it out." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held mine the way she used to when I was small, and something had frightened me. Firm, steady, like she was anchoring both of us. I told her about the foreclosure. I told her about Tuesday. I told her I had already reached out to an attorney and that we were going to file to stop it. I told her I needed her to do one thing, one hard thing. She could not contact Darius. She could not. He had a. If he gets. I left. I got back to the hotel and I opened my laptop and I started a document. Not notes on the case. Bernard had that. Not financial records. Renee had those. I started writing down what it had felt like, the way the trust had been manufactured, the specific moments that I now recognized, in retrospect, as techniques rather than genuine expression. The unlocked door. The way he had volunteered to help my mother without being asked. The document slipped in alongside dinner. I did not know yet what I would do with that document. I just knew I needed to write it while it was still fresh, before grief softened the edges of what I was seeing clearly right now. I wrote until midnight. Then I put the laptop away and I lay in the dark and I thought, 5 more days. I could do 5 more days. Renee called me Friday afternoon. "I found her," she said, and her voice had a particular quality to it. The tone she uses when she has found something significant and is deciding how to present it. Careful, precise, making sure I'm ready. "Tell me." Tanya Birch, 32 years old. Listed address in Midtown Atlanta, though she had also lived at addresses in Nashville and Charlotte over the past 6 years. On social media, she had a polished, aspirational presence. Travel photos, wellness content, captions about building generational wealth through real estate investing. The kind of account that could belong to any number of ambitious women in their 30s who had figured out how to make a life look a certain way online. "She looks legitimate on the surface," Renee said. "But here's what I found. 4 years ago in Nashville, she was a person of interest in a property fraud investigation. A man named Gerald Simmons ran a similar scheme out there. Shell company, power of attorney obtained from an elderly property owner. Fraudulent refinancing. Tanya's name appeared in the financial records. She was never charged. The case collapsed when the key witness recanted. I sat with that for a moment. So she's done this before. She and Darius have done this before, Renee said. I can't prove that yet. I can't put them in the same room in Nashville. But the structure of the Crestline operation matches the Nashville scheme in ways that are not coincidental. Same company structure, same document approach, Same target profile. What's the target profile? Women who recently inherited property or are managing family assets alone. Usually older properties in neighborhoods that have appreciated significantly. Usually a family member or close associate who builds trust before any documents change hands. She paused. Camille, you weren't a random target. Your mother's house in a neighborhood that's been gentrifying for 15 years, paid off or near paid off, managed by a daughter who is busy and professional and trusting. That is a very specific kind of target. I already knew that, but hearing it said plainly still hit differently. There's one more thing, Renee said. She told me that she had found Tanya's social media accounts going back 3 years, and in a photo from a resort in Turks and Caicos, a beach photo, 2 figures at the edge of the frame, she had spotted a man whose face was partially turned away from the camera, but his wrist was visible. And on that wrist was a watch I had given Darius for his 42nd birthday. Brushed steel, square face, a small engraving on the back that I had chosen myself. I had held that watch in my hands at the jewelry counter and felt proud of finding something that suited him. Send me the photo, I said. She did. I looked at it for a long time. Then I said, I need to talk to her. That same evening, I called Darius. I had set up a routing service that made the call appear to originate from a London number. Renee's idea. She had used it for a client once in a case that required a certain amount of misdirection, and she had walked me through how to configure it in about 10 minutes. It was not complicated. It did not require anything magical, just a downloaded app and a little patience. He answered on the second ring. Hey, babe. Still easy, still warm. Hey. I made myself sound tired, not sad. Tired. The tiredness of a long day in a different time zone. Just got back to the hotel. Long session this afternoon. What was it on? Predictive risk modeling in municipal finance. I had looked that up specifically so I could say something real if he asked follow-up questions. He didn't. He said that sounded like exactly my kind of thing and laughed a little. How's everything at home? I asked. Good. Quiet. I made that chicken you like, ate it alone. Very sad. Another small laugh. The house is too big when you're not in it. He said that. I sat in my hotel room and I listened to him say the house was too big without me, and I held the phone steady and I said, I know. I'll be back before you know it. We talked for 11 more minutes. He asked about the other presenters. I made up answers that were vague enough to not require specific knowledge. He told me about a movie he had watched, complained mildly about the weather, mentioned that he'd had coffee with a colleague. Normal. Ordinary. Completely constructed. When we hung up, I put the phone down on the bed and I stayed very still for a moment. I was thinking about how strange it is to perform normalcy for someone who has been performing it at you for years. Whether there was any difference, finally, between his version and mine. I decided the difference was that I knew what I was doing. Then I went back to reviewing documents. Saturday morning, I got a call from Renee that I had been half expecting. Meridian Equity Group was clean. It was a legitimate Atlanta-based real estate investment firm, licensed, audited, with a 16-year operating history. The reason their name had appeared in the Crestline transfer records was that Darius had used them for one early legitimate transaction, probably to establish a paper trail that looked credible and diversified. One real deal mixed in with the fraudulent ones. It made the records harder to read. I had spent 2 days running down a company that had nothing to do with any of this. I will tell you honestly that I sat with that for a few minutes and let myself feel the frustration of it. 2 days. Not irreplaceable, but not nothing. I had been chasing noise he had deliberately put into the system to slow someone like me down, which meant he had anticipated this. He had thought about what would happen if someone started looking, and he had built in misdirection in advance. I called Renee back. Drop Meridian, I said. Everything goes to Crestline, just Crestline. Already there, she said. We rebuilt the analysis around the single entity. And what emerged, once we stopped looking at the noise and focused on the signal, was actually cleaner, clearer, easier to follow and to document. The Meridian detour had cost us time, but it had also sharpened what we were looking at. By Saturday afternoon, Renee had a full transaction map, every dollar that had moved through Crestline since its incorporation, every account it had touched, every transfer that could be linked back to my mother's property. It was organized and precise and completely damning. I sent a copy to Bernard. He replied within the hour. This is everything we need. I want to be careful about how I describe what I did next, because I have told this story to a few people, and the response is usually either admiration or alarm, depending on the person. So I will just say that I went to Tanya Birch's building in Midtown on Sunday afternoon with a plan and a recording device and absolutely nothing to lose. I dressed professionally, blazer, simple jewelry, nothing that said confrontation, everything that said credibility. I had done enough background research on Tanya by then to know that she fancied herself a serious businesswoman, that she spoke the language of investment and strategy and portfolio management with the fluency of someone who had learned it specifically to impress people with it. I presented myself as a compliance consultant doing due diligence on small real estate investment entities in the Atlanta market. I said I had found Crestline Property Partners in my research and was impressed by their transaction volume for a newer firm. She let me in. The apartment was the kind of space that announces money without being specific about where the money came from. Everything was tasteful. Everything was expensive. There was a gallery wall of travel photos that I now recognized as documentation of a lifestyle built on other people's savings, though she did not know I knew that yet. We sat in her living room and I asked her questions about Crestline's business model. She answered with practiced confidence. I nodded. I made notes in a portfolio that contained, underneath the notepad, a phone set to record. After about 15 minutes, I shifted the conversation. I mentioned Nashville. Not Tanya's Nashville connection specifically, just that I had noted some similarities between Crestline's operating structure and a scheme that had been investigated there a few years ago. I said it offhandedly, as if it were a footnote, as if I already knew the full story and was simply giving her a chance to address it. Her confidence flickered, just for a second, just long enough. She said that the Nashville situation had been a misunderstanding, that she had been peripherally involved with someone whose practices she hadn't fully vetted, that she had learned from it. She said, I'm much more careful about who I partner with now. I said, and your current partner? Jackson Birch? No, wait, I'm sorry. Darius Holt? She corrected me on the last name without thinking. She said it was Holloway. Darius Holloway. Holloway, not Holt, a name I had never heard. I kept my face completely neutral. I wrote something in my notepad that was just loops and lines. She kept talking. She talked about the Cobble Hill. She said Cobble Hill, then caught herself and said Southwest Atlanta, a slip I noted but did not address. She talked about the timeline, the auction. The plan to flip and move the proceeds into their next acquisition. She talked about enough. When I stood to leave, I said I appreciated her time. She said she looked forward to seeing my report. I said I was sure she would find it thorough. I walked to the elevator. I rode it to the lobby. I walked to my car, sat down, and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for the last hour. Then I called Renee and I said, his real name might be Holloway. And Renee said, give me 20 minutes. I woke up at 4:45 on Monday morning without an alarm. I lay in the hotel bed for a few minutes in the dark and I thought about my father, not for any specific reason. He just came to me the way he sometimes does. Not as grief exactly, more as presence. His voice, the way he used to say my name when he was proud of something I had done. The suit he wore on the day I graduated from Spelman that he had pressed himself the night before because he wanted it to be right. I got up and I got dressed. I wore the Navy suit, the good one. The one I bought myself when I made partner at my firm 6 years ago. The one that fits exactly the way clothes are supposed to fit when you've finally stopped letting other people decide what you should look like. My father, the one time he saw me in it, had said, "There she is. That's my girl, right there." I drove to Southwest Atlanta and I parked down the street from my mother's house, from our family home, which was still ours, which would remain ours, which Bernard had made certain of with the court orders filed and confirmed. And I watched the front door. Darius came out at 8:32. He was dressed well, charcoal slacks, a jacket I recognized, the leather portfolio he used for meetings he considered important. He looked purposeful. He looked confident. He looked like a man who had spent the weekend confirming the details of a plan he believed was already in motion and unstoppable. He got in his car and drove toward downtown. I did not follow him. I had already been in contact with Bernard, who had been at the bank that morning when it opened, prepared to present the court order in person to the mortgage department. The foreclosure was halted. The Crestline accounts that had been tied to the property were flagged and frozen pending the fraud investigation. Every door Darius was planning to walk through on Monday morning was either already closed or about to be. I drove to my mother's house instead. She was up. Of course she was up. She had made biscuits and had coffee ready, and she was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in, looking like someone who had been awake for a while and was not going to say so. "Is it today?" she asked. "It's today," I said. She nodded and she pushed a cup of coffee toward me, and we sat together in her kitchen in the early morning quiet and we waited. He was gone for less than 2 hours. I was still at Miss Loretta's when my phone buzzed with a message from Bernard. 3 words. He just left, which meant the bank meeting had ended the way we expected it to end, with Darius being presented with the court order, the fraud notification, and the information that the foreclosure auction was halted pending investigation, which meant whatever had passed across his face when he read that paperwork, he had now left the building and was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I kissed my mother on the cheek and told her I would call her before the day was out. She held my face in both hands for a moment and looked at me the way she does when she has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. Then she just nodded and let me go. I drove to the house in Buckhead, our house. The house with the craftsman details and the high ceilings and the staircase that carries sound downhill like water. I let myself in through the front door and I sat down in the living room to wait. The chair I chose was one we had bought together at an estate sale 3 years ago. Wide arms, dark wood, upholstered in a fabric the color of old brick. Darius had loved it on sight. He said it had gravitas. I thought about that word while I waited. He came in 40 minutes later. I heard the key in the lock before I heard anything else. Then the door opening. Then a pause. He must have sensed something, or seen my bag near the entry, or simply felt the air in the house change the way air changes when it is occupied. Then his footsteps through the hall, moving with a speed that said he was somewhere between confused and alarmed. He stopped in the doorway of the living room. He looked at me. And for just a moment, 1 second, maybe 2, the face I had loved for 9 years showed me something I had never seen on it before. Not confusion, not guilt. Something underneath both of those. Something that looked a lot like the expression of a person who has just realized they miscalculated something fundamental. "Camille." His voice was very controlled. "What are you doing here? Why aren't you in London?" I looked at him from my seat in the chair with gravitas, and I said, "Because I never went." He tried confusion first. He said he didn't understand, asked what was going on, said I was scaring him, asked if something had happened to my mother. I let him finish. Then I said, "I came back from my insulin pen on Wednesday morning. I heard you on the phone with Tanya. I heard everything." The confusion performance stopped. He looked at me for a moment, and I watched him shift strategies the way I have watched people shift strategies in deposition rooms and interrogation transcripts. The micro-adjustment of expression, the recalibration of posture, the selection of the next tool in the kit. He chose regret. He said he could explain. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he had made mistakes, serious ones, and he knew that, and he was so sorry, and he needed me to understand that he had never meant for it to go as far as it went. He said he loved me. He said that was real, that had always been real. He said it in the voice he used to tell my mother he would miss her when we left after Sunday dinners. I let him finish that, too. Then I said, "Darius Holloway." His face went still in a way that was almost impressive. "That's your name," I said. "Not Holt. Not, depending on which document I'm looking at, whatever other version you've been using, Holloway, from Nashville. Where you and Tanya ran a version of this same scheme 4 years ago." I paused. "The woman you targeted there, the case collapsed when the witness recanted. I wonder how that happened." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Bernard has filed injunctions on the foreclosure and on every Crestline account he could identify," I continued. "The bank was presented with the fraud notification this morning, which is why your meeting ended the way it did. The district attorney's office has been contacted. Renee is submitting her full transaction analysis today." I looked at him steadily. "I have a recording of your conversation with Tanya on Sunday afternoon. She said quite a lot." He sat down. He hadn't meant to. I don't think it was a choice. His legs just made the decision for him. "Camille," he said, and this time the voice was different again, smaller, stripped of the technique. "Is there any way—" "No," I said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. The last-ditch shift, the one that comes when the soft approaches are exhausted. He looked at me with something cold in it, and he said, "You don't know what you've done. You think you've won something." "I think I've protected my mother's home," I said, "and I think you should save whatever you have left to say for your attorney." The sound of sirens reached us before he could respond. We both heard them at the same time. He looked toward the window. 3 vehicles turned onto our street, their lights moving in the gray Monday morning. He looked back at me. I stood up from the chair and I said, "You called my mother Mama." I let that sit there in the air between us. "That's what I keep coming back to," I said. "Not the money, not the forgeries. That. You sat at her table and you ate her food and you called her Mama and you were planning this the whole time." He didn't say anything. The doorbell rang. Then the knock. I walked past him to answer the door. The charges came down in stages. Wire fraud first because the Crestline transfers had crossed state lines through the Delaware incorporation. Forgery because of the 3 documents with my name on them. Identity fraud because Renee's deeper investigation, informed now by the name Holloway, revealed that he had used at least 2 additional variations of his identity in the years before we met. Conspiracy, shared with Tanya Birch, who was charged separately in a filing that cross-referenced the Nashville investigation. Tanya negotiated. She had a lawyer who moved quickly, and she had the Nashville connection hanging over her, and she was apparently considerably more interested in protecting herself than in protecting Darius. Within 2 weeks of the arrest, she had entered into a cooperation agreement with the district attorney's office. What she provided in exchange, documentation of the full scheme, a list of every entity they had used, a timeline of their operation going back 8 years, was, according to Bernard, more than enough to build the strongest possible case. 8 years. We had not been the beginning. We had been, as best anyone could determine, the 4th full operation they had run together. The Nashville case was the most recent prior. Before that, a woman in Charlotte who had lost a commercial property she had owned for 20 years. Before that, a retired teacher in Memphis whose late husband's insurance settlement disappeared into a company structure she had never been able to trace. The Charlotte woman had moved in with her daughter. She had not been able to rebuild financially at all. The teacher from Memphis had died 2 years after the fraud. Her daughter told investigators that she had never recovered from the shame of it, from believing for the rest of her life that she had been foolish enough to let it happen. She had not been foolish. She had been targeted by professionals who had spent years learning exactly how to read someone's vulnerabilities and turn them into access points. That is not the same thing. I know the difference because the difference matters. The weeks immediately after the arrest were the strangest of my life. There were practical tasks, which helped: conversations with Bernard, document submissions, calls with Renee as she finalized the forensic analysis. There was the divorce filing, which I handled through a separate attorney and which was uncomplicated in the technical sense, because we had no children, and because every asset Darius could have claimed was now tied up in fraud proceedings. What felt uncomplicated on paper felt enormous in the body. I packed his things. I did it on a Saturday morning, alone, while my mother sat in the kitchen with the door open so I could hear her moving around. I filled boxes without ceremony. His clothes, which I folded rather than threw in, because old habits are stubborn things. His books, which were fewer than I had expected. He had always presented himself as a reader, but when I looked at the shelves with new eyes, I realized he had been performing that too. The curated selection of titles that made a person look intellectual without necessarily requiring them to have read anything. A few personal items. The watch was not there. He had been wearing it when they took him. Good. I didn't want it. My coworker, Patrice, came and helped me move the boxes to a donation center without asking me questions I didn't want to answer. Afterward, we sat in my car in the parking lot of the donation center for about 20 minutes, and she said exactly one thing. "You know, none of this is about you, right?" I said I was working on that. She said, "Take your time." Miss Loretta's property was removed from foreclosure the morning of the court order. Bernard worked with a forensic financial recovery firm over the following months to trace the Crestline funds and recover what could be recovered. In the end, we got back approximately 65% of what had been taken. Not everything. The remainder had been spent. Travel, rent on Tanya's Midtown apartment, deposits on a property in the Caribbean that would now never close. I used a portion of the recovered funds to pay off my mother's mortgage completely. Then I worked with Bernard to establish a family trust that put the property into a structure that could not be accessed through any form of power of attorney granted by a single individual. The house my parents spent their lives building equity in was now secured in a way that made what Darius had done structurally impossible to replicate. Miss Loretta signed the trust documents at Bernard's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She wore her good coat. She brought Bernard a sweet potato pie, which he received with genuine emotion. On the way out, she stopped in the elevator and looked at me and said, "Your daddy would have handled it the same way." I said, "He would have done it faster." She said, "No, he wouldn't. He would have needed you to explain the financial parts." I laughed for the first time in weeks, a real one. It surprised me. I attended Darius's arraignment once. I sat in the gallery with my mother beside me, and I watched them bring him in. He did not look the way I had imagined he would. He looked ordinary, reduced, like something that had required a certain amount of performance to be impressive and had run out of energy for the performance. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that I understood was standard, and that would not hold. My mother held my hand through the whole proceeding. Afterward, she suggested we get lunch. We did. We sat in a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse and ate soup and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I felt the specific weight of the past several weeks begin, very slightly, to lift. The process of rebuilding a life after something like this is not linear. I want to say that clearly in case anyone listening has been through something in this family and is wondering why they're not further along than they feel they should be. It is not linear. Some weeks I felt capable and clear, and even something approaching grateful for what the experience had clarified. Other weeks I woke up at 3 a.m. with my heart going too fast, replaying conversations and wondering what I had missed and why I hadn't seen it sooner. Diana, my assistant, watched me navigate all of this from close range and said very little, which was exactly right. She covered for me when I needed it, showed up when I asked, and had a way of putting a coffee on my desk at the exact moment I needed one without making it a conversation. I owe her something I have not yet found the right way to say. Renee came over once a week for about 2 months. We cooked. She cooked mostly because I am an adequate cook at best, and she finds it meditative. And we talked about the case when I needed to, and about nothing when I needed that instead. She did not try to tell me how to feel about any of it. She did not suggest timelines or benchmarks or that I should be dating again by a certain point. She was just present in the way that a real person shows up for someone. Inconsistently, imperfectly, with a casserole dish, and occasionally the wrong thing to say followed by a quick correction. That, I have come to understand, is exactly what love actually looks like. Not the unlocked door and the sweet potato pie and the crying at the altar. Those things can be manufactured by someone who is skilled enough at reading what you need and producing the appearance of it. Love looks like Renee showing up on a Tuesday with a dish she made in a hurry after a long day at work and saying, "I burned the edges a little, but the middle is fine." Love looks like my mother in the 3rd row of every workshop asking questions that cut through the room like a warm knife. Love has edges. It has bad timing and burned edges and wrong words followed by better ones. I have learned to pay attention to the edges. 3 months later, I am sitting in a conference room on the 11th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta, looking out at the skyline, drinking bad conference coffee, and watching 12 women settle into their seats. They range in age from their late 30s to their early 70s. Some of them came because they saw the flyer. Some came because another woman in their life sent them the link. 2 of them came because they had already been through something close to what I went through and wanted to understand what they had missed. I started running this workshop 6 weeks after Darius's arraignment. I run it twice a month now, through my firm, offered at no cost. It covers financial fraud targeting women who manage family property or inherited assets. It covers the specific techniques that predators use to build access through trust. It covers what documents to read before you sign them and what to do when you realize you signed something you shouldn't have. It covers the difference between a person who shows up and a person who is performing showing up. I did not plan to become someone who runs workshops. I planned to be a forensic auditor who went to London to meet a client, came home to her marriage, and kept living the life she had built. But that life was built on a foundation that was not what I thought it was, and when it gave way, I had to decide what to build on the ground it left behind. I built this. My mother is in the 3rd row. She came to the first session, and she has not missed one since. She does not sit quietly. She asks questions that cut through to the center of things, in the way that only people who have lived long enough to stop being polite can do. Last month, a woman in her 40s was describing a situation with a property management agreement that her brother-in-law had asked her to sign, and before I could respond, Miss Loretta said, "Did you read it yourself, or did somebody explain it to you?" The woman said somebody had explained it. Miss Loretta said, "Read it yourself, always, even if it takes you longer, even if they sigh while you're doing it. Especially if they sigh while you're doing it." I had to take a sip of my coffee to cover my expression. After the session ends today, I will drive home to my apartment. Smaller than the house in Buckhead. Quieter. Mine in a way that house never fully was. I will make something for dinner and sit by the window with whatever book I am currently pretending to read, and I will think briefly about where Darius Holloway is right now. He is in a facility outside Atlanta, awaiting trial. His attorney has filed 2 motions that have both been denied. Tanya's cooperation agreement is holding, which means the evidence against him is substantially stronger than what my documentation alone would have provided. Bernard estimates the trial will happen within 8 months. He estimates the sentence, given the scope and duration of the scheme and the prior Nashville connection, will be significant. I do not think about him the way I expected to. I expected anger. I expected grief. I expected the particular kind of mourning that comes with discovering that something you believed was real was constructed specifically to deceive you. I have had all of those things. In the early weeks, I had them in waves. But what I am left with, 3 months later, is something I did not anticipate. I am left with clarity. I know something now that I did not know before, and the knowing cost me considerably more than I would have chosen to pay for it. I know what it looks like when someone is performing presence. I know the specific texture of manufactured warmth, the way it is slightly too consistent, the way it never has the rough edges that real things have. I know what it sounds like when the voice in the room is not for you. I do not know yet whether I will trust someone that way again. I think I will. I think trust is not a fixed resource that gets used up when it's misused. I think it's more like a muscle, damaged by injury, slowly rebuilt through careful use, never quite the same as before, but potentially stronger in the places that had to heal. I am not there yet, but I am here, in this conference room, with these 12 women, with my mother in the third row asking better questions than anyone in the room. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.